This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joplin Winner. The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood by Howard Pyle, Chapter 20. Robin Hood and Guy of Gisborne. A long time passed after the great shooting match, and during that time Robin followed one part of the advice of Sir Robert Lee, to wit, that of being less bold in his comings and goings. For though mayhap he may not have been more honest, as most folks regard honesty, he took good care not to travel so far from Sherwood that he could not reach it both easily and quickly. Great changes had fallen in this time, for King Henry had died, and King Richard had come to the crown that fitted him so well through many hard trials, and through adventures as stirring as any that ever befell Robin Hood. But though great changes came, they did not reach to Sherwood's shades, for there Robin Hood and his men dwelled as merrily as they ever had done, with hunting and feasting and singing and blithe woodland sports, for it was little the outside strivings of the world troubled them. The dawning of a summer's day was fresh and bright, and the birds sang sweetly in a great tumult of sound. So loud was their singing that it awakened Robin Hood where he lay sleeping, so that he stirred and turned and arose. Up rose Little John also, and all the merry men, and then after that they broke their fast, and they set forth hither and thither upon the doings of the day. Robin Hood and Little John walked down a forest path, where all around the leaves danced and twinkled as the breeze trembled through them and the sunlight came flickering down. Quoth Robin Hood, "I may make my vow, Little John, my blood tickles my veins as it flows through them this gay morn. What sayest thou to our seeking adventures, each one upon his own account?" "With all my heart," said Little John. "We have had more than one pleasant doing in that way, good master. Here are two paths. Take thou the one to the right hand, and I will take the one to the left, and then let each of us walk straight ahead till he tumbles into some merry doing or other." "I like thy plan," quoth Robin. "Therefore we will part here. But look thee, Little John, keep thyself out of mischief, for I would not have ill befall thee for all the world." "Marry, come up," quoth Little John. "How thou talkest! Methinks thou art wont to give thyself into tighter coils than I am like to do." At this Robin Hood laughed. "Why, in sooth, Little John," said he, "thou hast a blundering, hard-headed way that seemeth to bring thee right side uppermost in all thy troubles. But let us see who cometh out best this day." So saying, he clapped his palm to Little John's, and each departed upon his way, the trees quickly shutting the one from the other's sight. Robin Hood strolled onward till he came to where a broad woodland road stretched before him. Overhead the branches of the trees laced together in flickering foliage, all golden where it grew thin to the sunlight. Beneath his feet the ground was soft and moist from the sheltering shade. Here in this pleasant spot the sharpest adventure that ever befell Robin Hood came upon him. For, as he walked down the woodland path, thinking of naught but the songs of the birds, he came of a sudden to where a man was seated upon the mossy roots beneath the shade of a broad-spreading oak tree. Robin Hood saw that the stranger had not caught sight of him, so he stopped and stood quite still, looking at the other a long time before he came forward. And the stranger, I wot, was well worth looking at, for never had Robin Hood seen a figure like that sitting beneath the tree. From his head to his feet he was clad in a horse's hide, dressed with the hair upon it. Upon his head was a cowl that hid his face from sight, and which was made of the horse's skin. The ears were stuck up like those of a rabbit. His body was clad in a jacket made of the hide, and his legs were covered with the hairy skin likewise. By his side was a heavy broadsword and a sharp double-edged dagger. A quiver of smooth round arrows hung across his shoulders, and his stout bow of yew leaned against the tree beside him. "Hallo, friend!" cried Robin, coming forward at last. "Who art thou that sitteth there? And what is it that thou hast upon thy body? I make my vow I hath never seen such a sight in all my life before. Had I done an evil thing, or did my conscience trouble me, I would be afraid of thee, thinking that thou wast someone from down below, bringing a message bidding me come straightway to King Nicholas." To this speech the other answered not a word, but he pushed the cowl back from his head, and showed a knit brow, a hooked nose, and a pair of fierce, restless black eyes, which altogether made Robin Hood think of a hawk as he looked on his face. But besides this, there was something about the lines of the stranger's face, and his thin, cruel mouth, and the hard glare of his eyes, that made one's flesh creep to look upon. "Who art thou, rascal?" said he at last, in a loud, harsh voice. Tut, tut, quoth merry Robin, speak not so sourly, brother. Hast thou fed upon vinegar and nettles this morning, that thy speech is so stinging? And thou likest not my words? Said the other fiercely. Thou hadst best be jogging, for I tell thee plainly my deeds match them. Nay, but I do like thy words, thou sweet pretty thing, quoth Robin, squatting down upon the grass in front of the other. Moreover, I tell thee thy speech is witty and gamesome as any I ever heard in all my life. The other said not a word, but he glared upon Robin with a wicked and baleful look, such as a fierce dog bestows upon a man ere it springs at his throat. Robin returned the gaze with one of wide-eyed innocence, not a shadow of a smile twinkling in his eyes or twitching at the corners of his mouth. So they sat staring at one another for a long time, until the stranger broke the silence suddenly. "What is thy name, fellow?" said he. "Now," quoth Robin, "I am right glad to hear thee speak, for I began to fear the sight of me had stricken thee dumb. As for my name, it may be this, or it may be that, but methinks it is more meet for thee to tell me thine, seeing that thou art thy greater stranger in these parts. Prithee tell me, sweet chuck, why wearest thou that dainty garb upon thy pretty body?" At these words the other broke into a short, harsh roar of laughter. "By thy bones of the Daemon Odin," said he, "thou art the boldest spoken man that ever I have seen in all my life. I know not why I do not smite thee down where thou sittest, for only 2 days ago I skewered a man back at Nottingham town for saying not half so much to me as thou hast done. I wear this garb, thou fool, to keep my body warm. Likewise it is near as good as a coat of steel against a common sword thrust. As for my name, I care not who knoweth it. It is Guy of Gisborne, and thou mayest have heard it before. I come from the woodlands over in Herefordshire, upon the lands of the bishop of that ilk. I am an outlaw, and I get my living by hook and by crook in a manner it boots not now tell thee of. Not long since the bishop sent for me, and said that if I would do a certain thing that the Sherriff of Nottingham would ask of me, he would get me a free pardon, and give me 10 pounds to boot. So straightway I came to Nottingham town, and found my sweet sheriff, and what thinkest thou he wanted of me? Why, forsooth, to come here to Sherwood to hunt one Robin Hood, also an outlaw, and take him alive or dead. It seemeth that they have no one here to face that bold fellow, so he sent all the way to Herefordshire to me, for thou knowest the old saying, set a thief to catch a thief. As for the slaying of this fellow, it galleth me not a whit, for I would shed the blood of my own brother for the half of 200 pounds. To all this Robin listened, and as he listened his gorge rose. Well he knew of this Guy of Gisborne, and of all the bloody and murderous deeds that he had done in Herefordshire, for his doings were famous throughout all the land. Yet, although he loathed the very presence of the man, he held his peace, for he had an end to serve. "Truly," quoth he, "I have heard of thy gentle doings. Methinks there is no one in all the world that Robin Hood would rather meet than thee." At this Guy of Gisborne gave another harsh laugh. "Why," quoth he, "it is a merry thing to think of one stout outlaw like Robin Hood meeting another stout outlaw like the Guy of Gisborne. Only in this case it will be an ill happening for Robin Hood, for the day he meets Guy of Gisborne he shall die." "But thou gentle merry spirit," quoth Robin, "dost thou not think that mayhap this same Robin Hood may be the better man of the two? I know him right well, and many think that he is one of the stoutest men hereabouts." "He may be the stoutest of men hereabouts," quoth Guy of Gisborne, "yet I tell thee, fellow, this sty of yours is not the wide world. I lay my life upon it, I am the better man of the two. He an outlaw, forsooth. Why, I hear that he had never let blood in all his life, saving when he first came to the forest. Some call him a great archer. Marry, I would not be afraid to stand against him all the days of the year with a bow in my hand." "Why, truly, some folk do call him a great archer," said Robin Hood, "but we of Nottinghamshire are famous hands with the longbow. Even I, though but a simple hand at the craft, would not fear to try a bout with thee." At these words Guy of Gisborne looked upon Robin with wondering eyes, and then gave another roar of laughter till the woods rang. "Now," quoth he, "thou art a bold fellow to talk to me in this way. I like thy spirit in so speaking up to me, for few men have dared to do so. Put up a garland, lad, and I will try a bout with thee." "Tut, tut," quoth Robin, Only babes shoot at garlands hereabouts. I will put up a good Nottingham mark for thee." So saying, he arose, and going to a hazel thicket not far off, he cut a wand about twice the thickness of a man's thumb. From this he peeled the bark, and sharpening the point, stuck it up in the ground in front of a great oak tree. Thence he measured off 80 paces, which brought him beside the tree where the other sat. "There," quoth he, "is the kind of mark that Nottingham yeomen shoot at. Now let me see thee split the wand if thou art an archer." Then Guy of Gisborne arose. "Now out upon it," cried he. "The devil himself could not hit such a mark as that." "Mayhap he could, and mayhap he could not," quoth merry Robin. "But that we shall never know till thou hast shot thereat." At these words Guy of Gisborne looked upon Robin with knit brows, but as the yeoman still looked innocent of any ill meaning, he bottled his words and strung his bow in silence. Twice he shot, but neither time did he hit the wand, missing it in the first time by a span, and the second time by a good palm's breadth. Robin laughed and laughed. "I see now," quoth he, "that the devil himself could not hit thy mark. Good fellow, if thou art no better with the broadsword than thou art with the bow and arrow, thou wilt never overcome Robin Hood." At these words Guy of Gisborne glared savagely upon Robin. Quoth he, "Thou hast a merry tongue, thou villain, but take care that thou makest not too free with it, or I may cut it out with thy throat for thee." Robin Hood strung his bow and took his place with ne'er a word, albeit his heartstrings quivered with anger and loathing. Twice he shot, the first time hitting within an inch of the wand, the second time splitting it fairly in the middle. Then, without giving the other a chance for speech, he flung his bow upon the ground. "There, thy bloody villain!" cried he fiercely. "Let that show thee how little thou knowest of manly sports. And now look thy last upon the daylight, for the good earth hath been befouled long enough by thee, thou vile beast. This day, Our Lady willing, thou diest. I am Robin Hood." So saying, he flashed forth his bright sword in the sunlight. For a time Guy of Gisborne stared upon Robin as though bereft of wits, but his wonder quickly passed to a wild rage. "Art thou indeed Robin Hood?" cried he. "Now I am glad to meet thee, thou poor wretch. Strive thyself, for thou wilt have no time for striving when I am done with thee." So saying, he also drew his sword. And now came the fiercest fight that ever Sherwood saw, for each man knew that either he or the other must die, and that no mercy was to be had in this battle. Up and down they fought till all the sweet green grass was crushed and ground beneath the trampling of their heels. More than once the point of Robin Hood's sword felt the softness of flesh, and presently the ground began to be sprinkled with bright red drops, albeit not one of them came from Robin's veins. At last Guy of Gisborne made a fierce and deadly thrust at Robin Hood, from which he leapt back quickly, but in so leaping he caught his heel in a root and fell heavily upon his back. "Now, Holy Mary, aid me!" muttered he, as the other leapt at him with a grin of rage upon his face. Fiercely Guy of Gisborne stabbed at the other with his great sword, but Robin caught the blade in his naked hand, and though it cut his palm, he turned the point away so that it plunged deep into the ground close beside him. Then, ere a blow could be struck again, he leapt to his feet with his good sword in his hand. And now despair fell upon Guy of Gisborne's heart in a black cloud, and he looked around him wildly like a wounded hawk. Seeing that his strength was going from him, Robin leapt forward, and quick as a flash struck a broad-handed blow behind the sword arm. Down fell the sword from Guy of Gisborne's grasp, and back he staggered at the stroke, and, ere he could regain himself, Robin's sword passed through and through his body. Round he spun his heels, and flinging his hands aloft with a shrill, wild cry, fell prone upon his face upon the green sod. Then Robin Hood wiped his sword and thrust it back into the scabbard, and coming to where Guy of Gisborne lay, he stood over him with folded arms, talking to himself at the while. "This is the first man I have slain since I shot the king's forester in the hot days of my youth. I ofttimes think bitterly, even yet, of that first life I took, but of this I am glad as though I had slain a wild boar that lay waste a fair country. Since the Sherriff of Nottingham hath sent such a one as this against me, I will put on the fellow's garb and go forth to see whether I may not find his worship and perchance pay him back some of the debt I owe him upon this score." So saying, Robin Hood stripped the hairy garments from off the dead man, put them on himself, all bloody as they were, then strapping the other's sword and dagger around his body, and carrying his own in his hand, together with the 2 bows of yew, he drew the cowl of horse's hide over his face, so that none could tell who he was, and set forth from the forest, turning his steps toward the eastward in Nottingham town. As he strode along the country roads, men, women, and children hid away from him, for the terror of Guy of Gisborne's name and of his doings had spread far and near. And now let us see what befell Little John while these things were happening. Little John walked on his way through the forest path until he had come to the outskirts of the woodlands, where here and there fields of barley, corn, and green meadows lands lay smiling in the sun. So he came to the high road, and to where a little thatched cottage stood, black of cluster and twisted crab trees, with flowers in front of it. Here he stopped of a sudden, for he thought that he heard the sound of someone in sorrow. He listened, and found that it came from the cottage, so, turning his footsteps thither, he pushed open the wicket and entered the place. There he saw a gray-haired dame sitting beside a cold hearthstone, rocking herself to and fro, weeping bitterly. Now, Little John had a tender heart for the sorrows of other folk, so coming to the old woman and patting her kindly upon the shoulder, he spoke comforting words to her, bidding her cheer up and tell him her troubles, for that mayhap he may do something to ease them. At all this the good dame shook her head, but all the same his kind words did soothe her somewhat, so after a while she told him all that bore upon her mind. That morning she had 3 as fair, tall sons beside her as one could find in all Nottinghamshire, but that they were now taken from her, and were like to be hanged straightway, that one having come upon them, her eldest boy had gone out the night before into the forest, and had slain a hind in the moonlight. That the king's rangers had followed the blood upon the grass until they had come to her cottage, and had there found the deer's meat in the cupboard. That, as neither of the younger sons would betray their brother, the forester had taken all 3 away, in spite of the oldest, saying that he alone had slain the deer. That, as they went, she had heard the rangers talking among themselves, saying that the sheriff had sworn that he would put a check upon the great slaughter of deer that had been going on of late, hanging the first rogue caught thereupon the nearest tree, and that they would take the 3 youths to the King's Head Inn, near Nottingham town, where the sheriff was abiding that day, there to await the return of a certain fellow he had sent into Sherwood to seek for Robin Hood. To all this Little John listened, shaking his head sadly now and then. "Alas," quoth he, when the good dame had finished her speech, "this is indeed an ill case. But who is this that goeth into Sherwood after Robin Hood, and why doth he go to seek him? But no matter for that now, only that I would that Robin Hood were here to advise us. Nevertheless, no time may be lost in sending for him at this hour, if we would save the lives of thy 3 sons. Tell me, hast thou any clothes, Heron, that I may put in a place of these of Lincoln green? Marry, if our stout sheriff catches me without disguise, I am like to be run up more quickly than thy sons. Tell me, dame." Then the old woman told him that she had in the house some of the clothes of her good husband, who had only died 2 years before. These she brought to Little John, who, doffing his garb of Lincoln green, put them on instead. Then, making a wig and a false beard of uncarded wool, he covered his own brown hair and beard, and putting on a great tall hat that had belonged to the old peasant, he took his staff in one hand and his bow in the other, and set forth with all the speed to where the sheriff had taken up his inn. A mile or more from Nottingham town, and not far from the southern borders of Sherwood Forest, stood the cosy inn bearing the sign of the King's Head. Here was a great bustle and stir on this bright morning, for the sheriff and a score of his men had come to stop there and await Guy of Gisborne's return from the forest. Great hiss and fuss of cooking was going on in the kitchen, and great rapping and tapping of wine kegs and beer barrels was going on in the cellar. The sheriff sat within, feasting merrily of the best the place afforded, and the sheriff's men sat upon the bench before the door, quaffing ale, and lay beneath the shade of a broad-spreading oak trees, talking and jesting and laughing. All around stood the horses of the band, with a great noise of stamping feet and the great switching of tails. To this inn came the king's rangers, driving the widow's 3 sons before them. The hands of the 3 youths were tied tightly behind their backs, and a cord from neck to neck fastened them all together. So they were marched to the room where the sheriff sat at meat, and stood trembling before him as he scowled sternly upon them. "So," quoth he, in a great loud angry voice, "ye have been poaching upon the king's deer, have you? Now I will make short work of you this day, for I will hang up all three of you, as a farmer would hang up 3 crows to scare others of the kind from the field. Our fair county of Nottingham hath been too long a breeding place for such naughty knaves as ye are. I have put up with these things for many years, but now I will stamp them out at once, for all I will with you I will begin." Then one of the poor fellows opened his mouth to speak, but the sheriff roared at him in a loud voice to be silent, and bade the rangers to take him away till he had done his eating and could attend to the matters concerning them. So the 3 poor youths were marched outside, where they stood with bowed heads and despairing hearts, till after a while the sheriff came forth. Then he called his men about him, and quoth he, "These 3 villains shall be hanged straightway, but not here, lest they breed ill luck to this goodly inn. We will take them over yonder to that belt of woodlands, for I would fain hang them upon the very trees of Sherwood itself, to show these vile outlaws therein what they may expect of me, if ever I have the good luck to lay hands upon them." So saying, he mounted his horse, as did his men-at-arms likewise, and all together they set forth for the belt of woodlands he had spoken of, the poor youths walking in their midst, guarded by the rangers. So they came at last to the spot, and here nooses were fastened around their necks of the 3, and the ends of the cords flung over the branch of a great oak tree that stood there. Then the 3 youths fell upon their knees and loudly besought mercy of the sheriff. But the Sherriff of Nottingham laughed scornfully. "Now," quoth he, "I would that I had a priest here to shrive you, but as none is nigh, you must e'en travel your road with all your sins packed upon your backs, and trust to St. Peter to let you in through the gates of paradise like 3 peddlers into the town." In the meantime, while all this had been going forward, an old man had drawn near and stood leaning on his staff, looking on. His hair and beard were all curly and white, and across his back was a bow of yew that looked much too strong for him to draw. As the sheriff looked around ere he ordered his men to string the 3 youths up to the oak tree, his eyes fell upon this strange old man, and then his worship beckoned him to say, "Come hither, father, I have a few words to say to thee." So Little John, for it was none other than he, came forward, and the sheriff looked upon him, thinking that there was something strangely familiar in the face before him. "How now," said he, "methinks I have seen thee before. What may thy name be, father?" "Please, your worship," said Little John, in a cracked voice like that of an old man, "my name is Giles Hobble, at your worship's service." "Giles Hobble? Giles Hobble?" muttered the sheriff to himself, turning over the name that he had in his mind to try to find one to fit to this. "I remember not thy name," said he at last, "but it matters not. Hast thou a mind to earn 6pence this bright morn?" "Ay, marry," quoth Little John, "for money is not so plenty with me that I should cast 6pence away, and I could earn it by an honest turn. What is it your worship would have me do?" "Why, this," said the sheriff. "Here are 3 men that need hanging as badly as any e'er I saw. If thou wouldst string them up, I will pay thee 2pence apiece for them. I like not that my men-at-arms should turn hangmen. Wilt thou try thy hand?" "In sooth," said Little John, still in his old man's voice, "I had never done such a thing before, but and as 6pence is to be earned so easily, I might as well have it as anybody. But, your worship, are these naughty fellows strived?" "Nay," said Sheriff, laughing, "never a whit, but thou mayest turn thy hand to that also if thou art so minded. But hasten, I prithee thee, I would get back to mine inn betimes." So Little John came to where the 3 youths stood trembling, and putting his face to the first fellow's cheek as though he were listening to him, he whispered softly into his ear, "Stand still, brother, when thou feelest thy bands cut, but when thee seest me throw my woolen wig and beard from my head and face, cast thy noose from thy neck, and run for the woodlands." Then he slyly cut the cord that bound the youth's hands, who, upon his part, stood still as though he were yet bound. Then he went to the second fellow and spoke to him in the same way, and also cut his bounds. This he did to the 3rd likewise, but all so slyly that the sheriff, who sat upon his horse laughing, wotted not what was being done, nor his men either. Then Little John turned to the sheriff. "Please, your worship," said he, "will you give me leave to string my bow, for I would fain help these fellows along the way when they are swinging with an arrow beneath the ribs." "With all my heart," said the sheriff. "Only, as I said before, make thou haste in thy doings." Little John put the tip of his bow to his instep and strung the weapon so deftly that all wondered to see an old man so strong. Next, he drew a good smooth arrow from his quiver and fitted it to the string, and then, looking all around to see that the way was clear behind him, he suddenly cast away the wool from his head and face, shouting in a mighty voice, "Run!" Quick as a flash, the three youths flung the nooses from their necks and sped across the open to the woodlands as the arrow speeds from the bow. Little John also flew toward the covert like a greyhound, while the sheriff and his men gazed after him, all bewildered with the sudden doings. But ere the yeoman had gone far, the sheriff roused himself. "After him!" he roared in a mighty voice, for he knew now what it was with whom he had been talking, and wondered that he had not known him before. Little John heard the sheriff's words, and seeing that he could not hope to reach the woodlands before they would be upon him, he stopped and turned suddenly, holding his bow as though he were about to shoot. "Stand back!" cried he fiercely. "The first man that cometh a foot forward, a toucheth finger to bowstring dieth." At these words the sheriff's men stood as still as stalks, for they knew right well that Little John would be as good as his word, and that to disobey him meant death. In vain the sheriff roared at them, calling them cowards and urging them forward in a body. They would not budge an inch, but stood and watched Little John as he moved slowly away toward the forest, keeping his gaze fixed upon them. But when the sheriff saw his enemy thus slipping betwixt his fingers, he grew mad with rage, so that his head swam, and he knew not what he did. Then of a sudden he turned his horse's head, and plunging his spurs into its sides, he gave a great shout, and, rising in his stirrups, came down upon Little John like the wind. Then Little John raised his deadly bow and drew the gray goose feather to his cheek. But alas for him! For ere he could lose the shaft, the good bow that had served him so long split in his hands, and the arrow fell harmless at his feet. Seeing what had happened, the sheriff's men raised a shout, and, following their master, came rushing down upon Little John. But the sheriff was ahead of the others, and so caught up with the yeoman before he reached the shelter of the woodlands. Then, leaning forward, he struck a mighty blow. Little John ducked, and the sheriff's sword turned in his hand, but the flat of the blade struck the other upon the head and smote him down, stunned and senseless. "Now I am right glad," said the sheriff, when the men came up and found that Little John was not dead, "that I have not slain this man in my haste. I would rather lose 500 pounds than have him die thus instead of hanging, as such a vile thief should do. Go get some water from yonder fountain, Willem, and pour it over his head." The man did as he was bidden, and presently Little John opened his eyes and looked around him, all dazed and bewildered with the stunt of the blow. Then they tied his hands behind him, and lifting him up, set him upon the back of one of the horses, with his face to its tail and his feet strapped beneath its belly. So they took him back to the King's Head Inn, laughing and rejoicing as they went along. But in the meantime the widow's 3 sons had gotten safely away and were hidden in the woodlands. Once more the Sherriff of Nottingham sat with the King's Head Inn. His heart rejoiced within him, for he had last done that which he had sought to do for years, taken Little John prisoner. Quoth he to himself, "This time tomorrow the rogue shall hang upon the gallows tree in front of the great gate of Nottingham town, and thus shall I make my long score with him even." So saying, he took a deep draught of canary, but it seemed as if the sheriff had swallowed a thought with his wine, for he shook his head and put the cup down hastily. "Now," he muttered to himself, "I would not for 1,000 pounds have this fellow slip through my fingers. Yet should his master escape that foul Guy of Gisborne, there is no knowing what he may do, for he is the cunningest knave in all the world, this same Robin Hood. Belike I had better not wait until tomorrow to hang this fellow." So saying, he pushed his chair back hastily, and going forth from the inn, called his men together. Quoth he, "I will not wait no longer for the hanging of this rogue, but it shall be done forthwith, and that from that very tree whence he saved those 3 young villains, by stepping betwixt them at the law. So get ye ready straightway." Then once more they sat Little John upon the horse, with his face to the tail, and so, one leading the horse whereon he sat, and the others riding around him, they went forward to that tree from the branches of which they had thought to hang the poachers. On they went, rattling and jingling along the road, till they came to the tree. Here one of the men spoke to the sheriff of a sudden. "Your worship," cried he, "is not yon fellow coming along toward us that same Guy of Gisborne whom thou didst sent in the forest to seek Robin Hood?" At these words the sheriff shaded his eyes and looked eagerly. "Why, certes," quoth he, "yon fellow is the same. Now heaven send that he hath slain the master thief, as we will presently slay the man." When Little John heard this speech, he looked up, and straightway his heart crumbled away within him, for not only were the man's garments all covered with blood, but he wore Robin Hood's bugle horn, and carried his bow and broadsword. "How now?" cried the sheriff, when Robin Hood in Guy of Gisborne's clothes had come nigh to them. "What luck hath befallen thee in the forest? Why, man, thy clothes are all covered with blood." "And thou likest not my clothes?" said Robin, in a harsh voice like that of Guy of Gisborne. "Thou mayst shut thine eyes. Marry, the blood upon me is that of the vile outlaw that ever trod the woodlands, and one whom I have slain this day, albeit not without wound to myself." Then outspake Little John for the first time since he had fallen into the sheriff's hands. "O thou vile bloody wretch! I know thee, Guy of Gisborne, for who is there that hath not heard of thee, and cursed thee for the vile deeds of blood and rapine? Is it by such a hand as thine that the gentlest heart that ever beat is stilled in death? Truly thou art a fit tool for this coward Sherriff of Nottingham. Now I die joyfully, nor do I care how I die, for life is naught to me." So spake Little John, the salt tears rolling down his brown cheeks. But the Sheriff of Nottingham clapped his hands for joy. "Now, Guy of Gisborne," cried he, "if what thou tellest me is true, I will be the best day's doing for thee that ever thou hast done in all thy life." "What I have told thee is sooth, and I lie not," said Robin, still in Guy of Gisborne's voice. "Look, is not this Robin Hood's sword, and is not this his good bow of yew, and is not this his bugle horn? Thinkest thou he would have given them to Guy of Gisborne of his own free will?" Then the sheriff laughed aloud for joy. "This is a good day," cried he. "The great outlaw dead, and his right-hand man in my hands. Ask what thou wilt of me, Guy of Gisborne, and it is thine." "Then this I ask of thee," said Robin. "As I have slain the master, I would now kill the man. Give this fellow's life into my hands, Sir Sheriff." "Now thou art a fool," cried Sheriff. "Thou mightest have had money enough for a knight's ransom if thou hadn't asked for it. I like ill to let this fellow pass from my hands, but as I have promised, thou shalt have him." "I thank thee right heartily for thy gift," cried Robin. "Take the rogue down from the horse, men, and lean him against yonder tree while I show you how we stick a porker whence I come." At these words some of the sheriff's men shook their heads, for though they cared not a whit whether Little John were hanged or not, they hated to see him butchered in cold blood. But the sheriff called to them in a loud voice, ordering them to take the yeoman down from the horse, and lean him against the tree, as the others bade. While they were doing this, Robin Hood strung both his bow and that of Guy of Gisborne, albeit none of them took notice of his doing so. Then, when Little John stood against the tree, he drew Guy of Gisborne's sharp double-edged dagger. Fall back! Cried he. "Would ye crowd so on my pleasure, ye unmannerly knaves? Back, I say! Farther yet!" So they crowded back as he ordered, many of them turning their faces away, that they might not see what was about to happen. "Come!" cried Little John. "Here is my breast. It is meet that the same hand that slew my dear master should butcher me also. I know thee, Guy of Gisborne." "Peace, Little John," said Robin in a low voice. "Twice thou hast said thou knowest me, and yet thou knowest me not at all. Couldst thou not tell me beneath this wild beast's hide? Yonder, just in front of thee, lie my bow and arrow, likewise my broadsword. Take them when I cut thy bonds. Now, quickly, get them." So saying, he cut the bonds, and Little John, quick as a wink, leapt forward and caught up the bow and arrows and the broadsword. At the same time Robin Hood threw back the cowl of horse's hide from his face, and bent Guy of Gisborne's bow with a keen barbed arrow fitted to the string. "Stand back!" cried he sternly. "The first man that toucheth finger to bowstring dieth. I have slain thy man, Sheriff. Take heed that it is not thy turn next." Then, seeing that Little John had armed himself, he clapped his bugle horn to his lips and blew his 3 blasts, both loud and shrill. Now, when the Sheriff of Nottingham saw whose face it was beneath Guy of Gisborne's hood, and when he heard those bugle notes ring in his ear, he felt as if his hour had come. "Robin Hood!" roared he, and without another word he wheeled his horse in the road and went off in a cloud of dust. The sheriff's men, seeing their master thus fleeing for his life, thought that it was not their business to tarry longer, so clapping spurs to their horses, they also dashed away after him. But though the Sherriff of Nottingham went fast, he could not outstrip a cloth-yard arrow. Little John twanged his bowstring with a shout, and when the sheriff dashed in through the gates of Nottingham town at full speed, a grey goose shaft stuck out behind him like a molting sparrow with one feather in its tail. For a month afterward, the poor sheriff could sit upon naught but the softest cushion that could be gotten for him. Thus the sheriff and a score of men ran away from Robin Hood and Little John, so that when Will Stuteley and a dozen or more of stout yeomen burst from out of the cover, they saw naught of their master's enemies. For the sheriff and his men were scurrying away in the distance, hidden with a cloud of dust like a thunderstorm. Then they all went back into the forest once more, where they found the widow's 3 sons, who ran to Little John and kissed his hands. But it would not do for them to roam the forest at large any more, so they promised that, after they had gone and told their mother of their escape, they would come that night to the greenwood tree, and henceforth become men of the bond. End of chapter 20. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joplin Winner. The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood by Howard Pyle. Chapter 21. King Richard Comes to Sherwood Forest. Not more than 2 months had passed and gone since these stirring adventures befell Robin Hood and Little John, when all Nottinghamshire was a mighty stir and tumult, for King Richard of the Lion's Heart was making a royal progress through merry England, and everyone expected him to come to Nottingham town in his journeying. Messengers went riding back and forth between the sheriff and the king, until at last the time was fixed upon when his majesty was to stop in Nottingham as the guest of his worship. And now came more bustle than ever. A great running hither and thither, a rapping of hammers and babble of voices sounded everywhere through the place, for the folks were building great arches across the streets, beneath which the king was to pass, and were draping these arches with silken banners and streamers of many colors. Great hubbub was going on in the guildhall of the town also, for here a grand banquet was to be given to the king and the nobles of his train, and the best master carpenters were busy building a throne where the king and the sheriff were to sit at the head of the table, side by side. It seemed to many of the good folk of the place as if the day that should bring the king into the town would never come, but all the same it did come its own season, and bright shone the sun down into the stony streets, which were all alive with a restless sea of people. On either side of the way great crowds of town and country folk stood packed as close together as dried herring in a box, so that the sheriff's men, halberds in hands, could hardly press them back to leave space for the king's riding. "Take care whom thou pushest against," cried a great burly friar to one of these men. "Wouldst thou dig thine elbows into mine sire? By Our Lady of the Fountain, on thou dost not treat me with more deference, I will crack thy knave's pat for day, even though thou be one of the mighty sheriff's men." At this, a great shout of laughter arose from a number of tall yeomen in Lincoln green that were scattered through the crowd thereabouts, but one that seemed of more authority than the others nudged the holy man with his elbow. "Peace, Tuck," said he. "Didst thou not promise me, ere thou camest here, that thou would put a check upon thy tongue?" "Ay, marry," grumbled the other, "but I did not think to have a hard-footed knave trample over my toes as though they were no more than so many acorns in the forest." But of a sudden all this bickering ceased, for a clear sound of many bugle horns came winding down the street. Then all the people craned their necks and gazed in the directions whence they sound came, and the crowding and the pushing around the swaying grew greater than ever, and now a gallant array of men came gleaming into sight, and the cheering of the people ran down the streets as the fire runs in dry grass. 28 heralds in velvet and cloth of gold came riding forward. Over their heads fluttered a cloud of snow-white feathers, and each herald bore in his hand a long silver trumpet, which he blew musically. From each trumpet hung a heavy banner of velvet and cloth of gold, with the royal arms of England emblazoned thereon. After these came riding 50 noble knights, 2 by 2, all fully armed, saving that their heads were uncovered. In their hands they bore tall lances, from the tops of which fluttered pennons of many colors and devices. By the side of each knight walked a page, clad in rich cloths of silk and velvet, and each page bore in his hands his master's helmet, from which waved long floating plumes of feathers. Never had Nottingham seen a fairer sight than these 50 noble knights, from whose armor the sun blazed in dazzling light as they came riding on their great war horses, with clashing of arms and jingling of chains. Behind the knights came the barons and the nobles of the mid-country, in robes of silk and cloth of gold, with golden chains about their necks and jewels at their girdles. Behind these, again, came a great array of men-at-arms, with spears and halberds in their hands, and, in the midst of these, 2 riders side by side. One of the horsemen was the Sherriff of Nottingham in his robes of office. The other, who was a head taller than the sheriff, was clad in a rich but simple garb, with a broad, heavy chain around his neck. His hair and beard were like threads of gold, and his eyes were as blue as the summer sky. As he rode along, he bowed to the right hand and the left, and a mighty roar of voices followed him as he passed, for this was King Richard. Then, above all the tumult and the shouting, a great voice was heard roaring, "Heaven, its saints bless thee, our gracious King Richard, and likewise our Lady of the Fountain bless thee!" Then King Richard, looking toward the spot whence the sound came, saw a tall, burly, strapping priest standing in front of all the crowd with his legs wide apart as he backed against those behind. "By my soul, Sheriff," said the king, laughing, "ye have the tallest priest in Nottinghamshire that e'er I saw in my life. If heaven never answered prayers because of deafness, methinks, I would nevertheless have blessings bestowed upon me, for that man yonder would make the great stone image of St. Peter rub its ears and hearken unto him. I would that I had an army of such as he." To this the sheriff answered never a word, but all the blood left his cheeks, and he caught at the pommel of his saddle to keep himself from falling, for he also saw the fellow that so shouted, and knew him to be Friar Tuck. And, moreover, behind Friar Tuck he saw the faces of Robin Hood, and Little John, and Will Scarlet, and Will Stuteley, and Allan a Dale, and others of the band. "How now," said the king hastily, "art thou ill, sheriff, that thou growest so white?" "Nay, your majesties," said the sheriff, "it was naught but a sudden pain that will soon pass by." Thus he spoke, for he was ashamed that the king should know that Robin Hood feared him so little that he thus dared to come within the very gates of Nottingham town. Thus rode the king into Nottingham town on that bright afternoon in the early fall season, and none rejoiced more than Robin Hood and his merry men to see him come so royally unto his own. Eventide had come, the great feast in the Guild Hall at Nottingham town was done, and the wine passed freely. 1,000 waxen lights gleamed along the board, at which sat lord and noble and knight and squire in goodly array. At the head of the table, upon a throne all hung with cloth of gold, sat King Richard with the Sheriff of Nottingham beside him. Quoth the king to the sheriff, laughing as he spoke, "I have heard much spoken concerning the doings of certain fellows hereabouts, one Robin Hood and his band, who are outlaws and abide in Sherwood Forest. Canst thou not tell me somewhat of them, Sir Sheriff? For I hear that thou hast had dealings with them more than once." At these words the Sheriff of Nottingham looked down gloomily, and the Bishop of Hereford, who was present, gnawed his nether lip. Quoth the sheriff, "I can tell you, your majesty, but little concerning the doings of those naughty fellows, saving that they are the boldest lawbreakers in all the land." Then up spoke young Sir Henry of the Lea, a great favourite with the king, under whom he had fought in Palestine. "May it please your majesty," said he, "when I was away in Palestine, I heard ofttimes from my father, and in most cases I heard of this very fellow Robin Hood. If your majesty would like, I will tell you a certain adventure of this outlaw." Then the king, laughing, bade him tell his tale, whereupon he told how Robin Hood had aided Sir Richard of the Lea with money that he had borrowed from the Bishop of Hereford. Again and again the king and those present roared with laughter, while the poor bishop waxed cherry red in the face with vexation, for the matter was a sore thing with him. When Sir Henry of Lea was done, others of those present, seeing how the king enjoyed this merry tale, told other tales concerning Robin and his merry men. "By the hilt of my sword," said stout King Richard, "this is as bold and merry a knave as ever I heard tell of. Marry, I must take this matter in hand, and do what thou couldst not thee. Sheriff, do it, clear the forest of him and his band. That night the king sat in the place that was set apart from his lodgings while in Nottingham town. With him were young Sir Henry of Lee and 2 other knights and 3 barons of Nottinghamshire. But the king's mind still dwelled upon Robin Hood. "Now," quoth he, "I would freely give 100 pounds to meet this roguish fellow Robin Hood, and to see somewhat of his doings in Sherwood Forest." Then up spoke Sir Hubert of Gingham, laughing, "If your majesty hath such a desire upon you, it is not so hard to satisfy. If your majesty is willing to lose 100 pounds, I will engage to cause you not only to meet this fellow, but to feast with him in Sherwood." "Marry, Sir Hubert," quoth the king, "this pleaseth me well, but how wilt thou cause me to meet Robin Hood?" "Why, thus," said Sir Hubert. "Let your majesty and us here present put on the robes of 7 of the order of Blackfriars, and let your majesty hang a purse of 100 pounds beneath your gown. Then let us undertake to ride from here to Mansfield town tomorrow, and, without I am much mistaken, we will both meet with Robin Hood and dine with him before the day be past." "I like thy plan, Sir Hubert," quoth the king merrily, "and tomorrow we will try it and see whether there'll be virtue in it." So it happened that when early the next morning the sheriff came to where his liege lord was abiding, to pay his duty to him, the king told him what they had talked of the night before, and what merry adventure they were set upon undertaking that morning. But when the sheriff heard this, he smote his forehead with his fist. "Alas!" said he, "what evil counsel is this that hath been given thee? Oh, my gracious lord and king, you know not what you do. This villain that you thus go to seek hath no reverence either for king or king's laws." But did I not hear aright when I was told that this Robin Hood hath shed no blood since he was outlawed, saving only that of that vile Guy of Gisborne, for whose death all honest men should thank him?" "Yea, your majesty," said the sheriff, "you have heard aright, nevertheless." "Then," quoth the king, breaking in on the sheriff's speech, "what have I to fear in meeting him, having done him no harm? Truly, there is no danger in this. But mayhap thou wilt go with us, Sir Sheriff?" "Nay," quoth the sheriff hastily, "heaven forbid." But now 7 habits such as Blackfriars wear were brought, and the king and those about him having clad themselves therein, and his majesty having hung a purse with 100 golden pounds in it beneath his robes, they all went forth and mounted the mules that had been brought to the door for them. Then the king bade the sheriff be silent as to their doings, and so they set forth upon their way. Onward they travelled, laughing and jesting until they passed through the open country, between bare harvest fields whence the harvest had been gathered home, through scattered glades that began to thicken as they went farther along, till they came within the heavy shade of the forest itself. They travelled in the forest for several miles without meeting anyone such as they sought, until they had come to that part of the road that lay nearest to Newstead Abbey. "By the holy Saint Martin," quoth the king, "I would that I had a better head for remembering things of great need. Here have we come away and brought never so much as a drop of anything to drink with us. Now I would give half 100 pounds for somewhat to quench my thirst withal." No sooner had the king so spoken than out from the covert at the roadside stepped a tall fellow with yellow beard and hair and a pair of merry blue eyes. "Truly, holy brother," saying he, laying his hand upon the king's bridle rein, "it were an unchristian thing to not give fitting answer to so fair a bargain. We keep an inn hereabouts, and for 50 pounds we will not only give thee a good draught of wine, but we will give thee as noble a feast as ever thou did tickle thy gullet withal." So saying, he put his fingers to his lips and blew a shrill whistle. Then straightway the bushes and branches on either side of the road swayed and crackled, and 80 broad-shouldered yeomen in Lincoln green burst out into the covert. "How now, fellow?" quoth the king. "Why, who art thou, thou naughty rogue? Hast thou no regard for such holy men as we are?" "Not a whit," quoth merry Robin Hood, for the fellow was he. "For in sooth all the holiness belonging to rich friars, such as ye are, one could drop into a thimble, and the good wife would never feel it with the tip of her finger. As for my name, it is Robin Hood, and thou mayest have heard it before." "Now out upon thee," quoth King Richard. "Thou art a bold and naughty fellow, and a lawless one withal, as I have often heard tell. Now, prithee let me and these brethren of mine travel forward in peace and quietness." "It may not be," said Robin, "for it would look but ill of us to let such holy men travel onward with empty stomachs. But I doubt not that thou hast a fat purse to pay the score at our inn, since thou offered freely so much for a poor draught of wine. Show me thy purse, reverend brother, or I may perchance have to strip thy robes from thee to search for it myself." "Nay, use no force," said the king sternly. "Here is my purse, but lay not the lawless hands upon our person." "Ah, tut, tut," quoth merry Robin, "what proud words are these? Art thou the King of England to talk so to me? Here, Will, take this purse and see what there is within." Will Scarlet took the purse and counted out the money. Then Robin bade him keep 50 pounds for himself and put 50 back into the purse. This he handed to the king. "Here, brother," quoth he, "take this half of thy money, and thank Saint Martin, on whom thou didst call before, that thou hast fallen into the hands of such gentle rogues that they will not strip thee bare as they might do. But wilt thou not pat thy cow? For I would fain see thy face." "Nay," said the king, "I may not put back my cow, for we 7 have vowed that we will not show our faces for 24 hours." "Then keep them covered in peace," said Robin, "and forbe it from me to make you break your vows." So he called 7 of his yeomen and bade them each take a mule by the bridle. Then, turning their faces toward the depths of the woodland, they journeyed onward until they came to the open glade and greenwood tree. Little John, with 80 yeomen at his heels, had also gone forth that morning to wait along the roads and bring a rich guest to Sherwood glade, if such might be his luck, for many with fat purses must travel the roads at this time, when such great doings were going on in Nottinghamshire. But though Little John and so many others were gone, Friar Tuck and 20 or more stout yeomen were seated or lying around beneath the great tree, and when Robin and the others came, they leapt to their feet to meet him. "By my soul," quoth merry King Richard, when he had gotten down from his mule and stood looking about him, "thou hast in a very truth a fine lot of young men about thee, Robin. Methinks King Richard himself would be glad of such a bodyguard." "Ah, these are not all my fellows," said Robin proudly, "for 80 more of them are away on business with my good right-hand man, Little John. But as for King Richard, I tell thee, brother, there is not a man of us all but would pour out our blood like water for him. Ye churchmen cannot rightly understand our king, but we yeomen love him right loyally for the sake of his brave doings, which are so like our own." But now Friar Tuck came bustling up. "Ge ye good den, brothers," said he. "I am right glad to welcome some of my cloth in this naughty place. Truly, methinks these rogues of outlaws would stand but an ill chance were it not for the prayers of holy Tuck, who laboureth so hard for their well-being." Here he winked one eye slyly, and stuck his tongue into his cheek. "Who art thou, mad priest?" said the king in a serious voice, albeit he smiled beneath his cowl. At this, Friar Tuck looked all around with a slow gaze. "Look you now," quoth he, "never let me hear you say again that I am no patient man. Here is a knave of friar calleth me a mad priest, and yet I smite him not. My name is Friar Tuck, fellow, the holy Friar Tuck." "There, Tuck," said Robin, "thou hast said enow. Prithee cease thy talk and bring some wine. These reverend men are athirst, and sin they have paid so richly for their score, they mustn't have the best." Friar Tuck bridled at being so checked in his speech. Nevertheless, he went straight away to do Robin's bidding. So presently a great crock was brought, and wine was poured out for all the guests and for Robin Hood. Then Robin held his cup aloft. "Stay," cried he, "tarry in your drinking till I give you a pledge. Here is to good King Richard of great renown, and may all enemies to him be confounded." Then all drank the king's health, even the king himself. "Methinks, good fellow," said he, "thou hast drunk to thine own confusion." "Ne'er a whit," quoth merry Robin, "for I tell thee that we of Sherwood are more loyal to our lord the king than those of thine order. We would give up our lives for his benefiting, while ye are constant to lie snug in your abbeys and priories, let reign who will." At this the king laughed. Quoth he, "Perhaps King Richard's welfare is more to me than thou wottest of, fellow. But enough of that matter. We have paid well for our fare, so canst thou not show us some merry entertainment? I have often heard that ye are wondrous archers. Wilt thou not show us somewhat of your skills?" "With all my heart," said Robin. "We are always pleased to show our guests all the sport that is to be seen." As Gaffer Swantholt saith, "'Tis a hard hearth that will not give a caged starling of the best, and caged starlings ye are with us. Ho, lads, set up garlands at the end of the glade." Then, as the yeomen ran to their master's bidding, Tuck turned to one of the mock friars. "Hearest thou our master?" quoth he, with a sly wink. "Whenever he cometh across some poor piece of wit, he straightway layeth on the shoulders of this Garfald Swantholt, whoever he may be, so that the poor good man goeth travelling about with all the odds and ends and tags and rags of our master's brain packed on his back." Thus spake Friar Tuck, but in a low voice, so that Robin could not hear him, for he felt somewhat nettled at Robin's cutting his talk so short. In the meantime, the mark at which they were to shoot was set up 60 paces distance. It was a garland of leaves and flowers, 2 spans in width, which same was hung upon a stake in front of a broad tree trunk. "There," quoth Robin, "yon is a fair mark, lads. Each of you shoot 3 arrows thereat, and if any fellow misseth by so much as 1 arrow, he shall have a buffet of Will Scarlet's fist." "Hearken to him," quoth Friar Tuck. "Why, master, thou dost bestow buffets from thy strapping nephew as though they were love-taps from some bouncing lass. I warrant thou art safe to hit the garland thyself, or thou wantst not to be so free of his cuffing." First David of Doncaster shot, and lodged all 3 of his arrows within the garland. "Well done, David!" cried Robin. "Thus hath saved thine ears from a morming this day." Next Midge the miller shot, and he also lodged his arrows in the garland. Then followed Wat the tinker, but alas for him, for one of his shafts missed the mark by the breadth of 2 fingers. "Come hither, fellow," said Will Scarlet, in his soft, gentle voice. "I owe thee somewhat that I would pay forthwithin." Then Wat the tinker came forward and stood in front of Will Scarlet, screwing up his face and shutting his eyes tightly, as though he already felt his ears ringing with the buffet. Will Scarlet rolled up his sleeves, and standing on tiptoe to give the greater swing to his arm, he struck with might and main. Woof! Came his palm against the tinker's head, and down went stout Wat to the grass, heels over head, as the wooden image at the fair ground goes down when the skilful player throws a cudgel at it. Then, as the tinker sat up upon the grass, rubbing his ears and winking and blinking at the bright stars that danced between his eyes, the yeomen roared with mirth till the forest rang. As for King Richard, he laughed till the tears ran down his cheeks. Thus the band shot each in turn, some getting off scot-free, some winning a buffet that always sent them to the grass. And now, last of all, Robin took his place, and all was hushed as he shot. The first shaft he shot split a piece from the stake on which the garland was hung. The second lodged within an inch of the other. "By my halidom," said King Richard to himself, "I would give 1,000 pounds for this fellow to be one of my guard." And now for the 3rd time Robin shot. But alas for him, the arrow was ill-feathered, and wavered to one side. It smote an inch outside the garland. At this a great roar went up, those of the yeomen who sat upon the grass rolling over and over, shouting with laughter, for never before had they seen their master so miss the mark. But Robin flung his bow upon the ground with vexation. "Now out upon it," cried he. "That shaft had an ill feather to it, for I felt it as it left my fingers. Give me a clean arrow, and I will engage to split the wand with it." At these words the yeoman laughed louder than ever. "Nay, good uncle," said Will Scarlet in his soft, sweet voice, "thou hast thy fair chance, and hast missed thine aim out and out. I swear the arrow was as good as any that hath been loosened this day. Come hither, I owe thee somewhat, and would fain pay it." "Go, good master," roared Friar Tuck, "and may blessing go with thee. Thou hast bestowed these love-taps of Will Scarlet's with great freedom. It were pity on thou gottest not thine own share." "It may not be," said merry Robin. "I am king here, and no subject may raise hand against the king. But even our great King Richard may yield to the holy Pope without shame, and even take a tap from him by way of penance. Therefore I will yield myself to this holy friar, who seemeth to be one in authority, and will take my punishment from him." Thus saying, he turned to the king. "I prithee, brother, wilt thou take my punishing into thy holy hands?" "With all my heart," quoth merry King Richard, rising from where he was sitting. "I owe thee somewhat for having lifted a heavy weight of 50 pounds from my purse, so make room for him and the green lads." "And thou makest me tumble," quoth Robin. "I will freely give thee back thy 50 pounds, but I tell thee, brother, if thou makest me not feel grass all along my back, I will take every farthing thou hast for thy boastful speech." "So be it," said the king. "I am willing to venture it." Thereupon he rolled up his sleeve and showed an arm that made the yeomen stare. Robin, with his feet wide apart, stood firmly planted, waiting the other, smiling. Then the king swung back his arm, and balancing himself a moment, he delivered a buffet at Robin that fell like a thunderbolt. Down went Robin headlong upon the grass, for the stroke would have felled a stone wall. Then how the yeomen shouted with laughter, till their sides ached, for never had they seen such a buffet given in all their lives. As for Robin, he presently sat up and looked all around him, as though he had dropped from a cloud and had lit in a place he had never seen before. After a while, still gazing about him at his laughing yeoman, he put his fingertips softly to his ear and felt all around it tenderly. "Will Scarlet," said he, "count this fellow out his 50 pounds. I want nothing more either of his money or of him. Or a merman seized him and his buffeting. I would that I had taken my dues from thee, for I verily believe he hath deafened mine ear from ever hearing again." Then, while gusts of laughter still broke from the band, Will Scarlet counted out the 50 pounds, and the king dropped it back into his purse again. "I give thee thanks, fellow," said he, "and if ever thou shalt wish for another box of the ear to match the one thou hast, come to me, and I will fit thee with one for naught." So spake the merry king. But even as he ended, there came suddenly the sound of many voices, and out from the covert burst Little John and 60 men with Sir Richard of the Lea in his midst. Across the glade they came running, and as they came, Sir Richard shouted to Robin, "Make haste, dear friend, gather thy band together, and come with me. King Richard left Nottingham town this very morning, and cometh to seek thee in the woodlands. I know not how he cometh, for it was but a rumor of this that reached me. Nevertheless, I know that it is the truth. Therefore hasten with all thy men, and come to Castle Lea, for there thou mayest lay hidden till thy present danger passeth." "Who are these strangers that thou hast with thee?" "Why," quoth merry Robin, rising from the grass, "these are certain gentle guests that come with us from the high road over by Newstead Abbey. I know not their names, but I have become right well acquaint with this lusty rogue's palm this morning. Marry, the pleasure of this acquaintance hath dost me a deaf ear and 50 pounds to boot." Sir Richard looked keenly at the tall friar, who, drawing himself up to his full height, looked fixedly back at the knight. Then, of a sudden, Sir Richard's cheek grew pale, for he knew who it was that he looked upon. Quickly he leapt from off his horse's back and flung himself upon his knees before the other. At this, the king, seeing that Sir Richard knew him, threw back his cowl, and all the yeomen saw his face, and knew him also. For there was not one of them but had been in the crowd of the good town of Nottingham, and had seen him riding side by side with the sheriff. Down they fell upon their knees, nor could they say a word. Then the king looked all around right grimly, and last of all his glance came back and rested again upon Richard of Lea. "How is this, Sir Richard?" said he sternly. "How darest thou step between me and these fellows? And how darest thou offer thy knightly castle of the Lea for a refuge to them? Wilt thou make it a hiding-place for the most renowned outlaws in England?" Then Sir Richard of the Lea raised his eyes to the king's face. "Far be it from me," said he, "to do aught that could bring your majesty's anger upon me. Yet sooner would I face your majesty's wrath than suffer aught of harm that I could stay to fall upon Robin Hood and his band. For to them I owe life, honor, everything. Should I, then, desert him in this hour of need?" Ere the knight had done speaking, one of the mock friars that stood near the king came forward and knelt beside Sir Richard, and throwing back his cowl, showed the face of young Sir Henry of the Lea. Then Sir Henry grasped his father's hand and said, "Here kneels one who hath served thee well, King Richard, and as thou knowest hath stepped between thee and death in Palestine. Yet do I abide by my dear father, and here I say also that I would freely give shelter to this noble outlaw, Robin Hood, even though it brought thy wrath upon me, for my father's honor and my father's welfare are as dear to me as mine own." King Richard looked from one to the other of the kneeling knights, and at last the frown faded from his brow, and a smile twitched at the corner of his lips. "Marry, Sir Richard," quoth the king, "thou art a bold-spoken knight, and thy freedom of speech weigheth not heavily against thee with me. This young son of thine, taken after his sire both in boldness of speech and of deed, for, as he saith, he stepped one time betwixt me and death, wherefore I would pardon thee for his sake, even if thou hast done more than thou hast. Rise all ye, for ye shall suffer no harm through me this day, for it were pity that a merry time should end in a manner as to mar its joyousness." Then all arose, and the king beckoned Robin Hood to come to him. "How now," quoth he, "is thine ear still too deaf to hear me speak?" "Mine ears would be deafened in death ere they would cease to hear your Majesty's voice," said Robin. "As for the blow that your Majesty struck me, I would say that though my sins are haply many, methinks they have been paid up in full thereby." "Ah, thinkest thou so?" said the King, with somewhat of a sternness in his voice. "Now I tell thee that but for three things, to wit, my mercifulness, my love for a stout woodsman, and the loyalty thou hast avowed for me, thine ears mayhap may have been more tightly closed than ever a buffet for me could have shut them. Talk not lightly of thy sins, good Robin, but come look up. Thy danger is past, for hereby I give thee and all thy band free pardon. But, in sooth, I cannot let you roam the forest as ye have done in the past. Therefore I will take thee at thy word, when thou didst say thou wouldst give thy service to me, and thou shalt go back to London with me. Who will take that bold knave, Little John, also, and likewise thy cousin, Will Scarlet, and thy minstrel, Allan a Dale. As for the rest of thy band, we will take their names and have them duly recorded as royal rangers, for methinks it were wiser to have them changed to law-abiding caretakers of our deer in Sherwood than to leave them to run at large as outlaw slayers thereupon. But now, get a feast ready. I would see how ye live in the woodlands." So Robin bade his men make ready a grand feast. Straightway great fires were kindled and burned brightly, at which savory things roasted sweetly. Whilst this was going forward, the King bade Robin call Allan a Dale, for he would hear him sing. So word was passed for Allan, and presently he came, bringing his harp. "Marry," said King Richard, "if thy singing match thy looks, it is fair enough. Prithee, strike up a ditty, and let us have taste of thy skill." Then Allan touched his harp lightly, and all words were hushed while he sang thus.
"O where hast thou been, my daughter? O where hast thou been this day, daughter, my daughter? Oh, I have been to the river's side, where the waters lie all grey and wide, and the grey sky broods o'er the leaden tide, and the shrill wind sighs a-straining, and the shrill wind sighs a-straining. What sawest thou there, my daughter? What sawest thou there this day, daughter, my daughter? Oh, I saw a boat come drifting nigh, where the quivering rushes hiss and sigh, and the water soughs as it gurgles by, and the shrill wind sighs a-straining, and the shrill wind sighs a-straining. What sailed in the boat, my daughter? What sailed in the boat this day, daughter, my daughter? Oh, there was a one all clad in white, and about his face hung a pallid light, and his eyes gleamed sharp like the stars at night, and the shrill wind sighed a-straining, and the shrill wind sighed a-straining. And what said he, my daughter? What said he to thee this day, daughter, my daughter? Oh, said he naught, but did he this? Thrice on my lips did he press a kiss, and my heartstrings shrunk with an awful bliss, and the shrill wind sighed a-straining, and the shrill wind sighed a-straining. Why growest thou so cold, my daughter? Why growest thou so cold and white, daughter, my daughter? Oh, never a word the daughter said, but she sat all straight with a drooping head, for her heart was stilled and her face was dead, and the shrill wind sighed a-straining, and the shrill wind sighed a-straining.
All listened in silence, and when Allan a Dale had done, King Richard heaved a sigh. "By the breath of my body, Allan," quoth he, "thou hast such a wondrous sweet voice that it strangely moves my heart. But what doleful ditty is this for the lips of a stout yeoman? I would rather hear thee sing a song of love and battle than a sad thing like that. Moreover, I understand it not. What meanest thou by the words?" "I know not, your Majesty," said Allan, shaking his head, "for oft-times I sing that which I do not clearly understand mine own self." "Well, well," quoth the King, "let it pass. Only I tell thee this, Allan, thou shouldest turn thy songs to such matter as I spoke of, to wit, love or war. For in sooth thou hast a sweeter voice than Blondel, and methought he was the best minstrel that ever I heard. But now one came forward and said that the feast was ready. So Robin Hood brought King Richard and those with him to where it lay all spread out on fair white linen cloths, which lay upon the soft green grass. Then King Richard sat him down, and feasted, and drank, and when he was done he swore roundly that he had never sat at such a lusty repast in all his life before. That night he lay in Sherwood Forest upon a bed of sweet green leaves, and early the next morning he set forth from the woodlands for Nottingham town, Robin Hood and all his band going with him. You may guess what a stir there was in the good town when all those famous outlaws came marching into the streets. As for the sheriff, he knew not what to say nor where to look when he saw Robin Hood in such high favor with the king, while all his heart was filled with gall because of the vexation that lay upon him. The next day the king took leave of Nottingham town. So Robin Hood and Little John and Will Scarlet and Allan a Dale shook hands with all the rest of the band, kissing the cheeks of each man, and swearing that they would often come to Sherwood and see them. Then each mounted his horse and rode away in the train of the king. End of Chapter 21. The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit www.librivox.org. Today's reading by Alex Foster, www.alexfoster.me.uk. The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood by Howard Pyle. Epilogue. Thus end the merry adventures of Robin Hood, for in spite of his promise it was many a year ere he saw Sherwood again. After a year or two at court, Little John came back to Nottinghamshire, where he lived in an orderly way, though within sight of Sherwood, and where he achieved great fame as the champion of all England with the quarterstaff. Will Scarlet, after a time, came back to his own home, whence he had been driven by his unlucky killing of his father's steward. The rest of the band did their duty as royal rangers right well. But Robin Hood and Allan a Dale did not come again to Sherwood so quickly, for thus it was. Robin, through his great fame as an archer, became a favourite with the king, so that he speedily rose in rank to be chief of all yeomen. At last the king, seeing how faithful and how loyal he was, created him Earl of Huntingdon, so Robin followed the king to the wars, and found his time so full that he had no chance to come back to Sherwood for even so much as a day. As for Allan a Dale and his wife, the fair Ellen, they followed Robin Hood and shared in all his ups and downs of life. And now, dear friend, you who have journeyed with me in all these merry doings, I will not bid you follow me further, but will drop your hand here with a good den if you wish it. For that which cometh hereafter speaks of the breaking up of things, and shows how joys and pleasures that are dead and gone can never be set upon their feet to walk again. I will not dwell upon the matter over long, but will tell as speedily as I may of how that stout fellow Robin Hood died as he had lived, not at the court as Earl of Huntingdon, but with bow in hand, his heart in the green wood, and he himself a right yeoman. King Richard died upon the battlefield, in such a way as properly became a lion-hearted king, as you yourself no doubt know. So after a time the Earl of Huntingdon, or Robin Hood as we still call him, as of old, finding nothing for his doing abroad, came back to merry England again. With him came Allan a Dale and his wife, the fair Ellen, for these two had been chief of Robin's household ever since he had left for Sherwood Forest. It was in the springtime when they landed once more on the shores of England. The leaves were green, and the small birds sang blithely, just as they used to do in fair Sherwood when Robin Hood roamed the woodland shades with a free heart and a light heel. All the sweetness of the time and the joyousness of everything brought back to Robin's mind his forest life, so that a great longing came upon him to behold the woodlands once more. He went straightway to King John and besought leave of him to visit Nottingham for a short season. The king gave him leave to come and go, but bade him not stay longer than 3 days at Sherwood. So Robin Hood and Allan a Dale set forth without delay to Nottinghamshire and Sherwood Forest. The first night they took up their inn at Nottingham town, yet they did not go to pay their duty to the sheriff, for his worship bore many a bitter grudge against Robin Hood, which grudges had not been lessened by Robin's rise in the world. The next day at an early hour they mounted their horses and set forth for the woodlands. As they passed along the road, it seemed to Robin that he knew every stick and stone that his eyes looked upon. Yonder was a path that he had oft-times trod of a mellow evening with Little John beside him. Here was one, now nigh choked with brambles, along which he and a little band had walked when they went forth to see a certain curtal friar. Thus they rode slowly onward, talking about these old familiar things, old and yet new, for they found more in them than they had ever thought of before. Thus at last they came to the open glade, and the broad, wide-spreading greenwood tree which was their home for so many years. Neither of the two spoke when they stood beneath that tree. Robin looked all about him at the well-known things, so like what they used to be, and yet so different. For, where once was the bustle of many busy fellows, was now the quietness of solitude, and as he looked, the woodlands, the greensward, and the sky all blurred together in his sight through salt tears, for such a yearning came upon him as he looked on these things, as well known to him as the fingers of his right hand, that he could not keep back the water from his eyes. That morning he had slung his good old bugle horn over his shoulder, and now with the yearning came a great longing to sound his bugle once more. He raised it to his lips, he blew a blast. Tirilla lirilla, the sweet clear notes went winding down the forest paths, coming back again from the more distant bosky shades in faint echoes of sound. Tirilla lirilla, tirilla lirilla, lirilla, until it faded away and was lost. Now it chanced that on that very morn Little John was walking through a spur of the forest upon certain matters of business, and as he paced along, sunk in meditation, the faint clear notes of a distant bugle horn came to his ear. As leaps the stag when it feels the arrow at its heart, so leapt Little John when that distant sound met his ear. All the blood in his body seemed to rush like a flame into his cheeks as he bent his head and listened. Again came the bugle note, thin and clear, and yet again it sounded. Then Little John gave a great, wild cry of yearning, of joy and yet of grief, and, putting down his head, he dashed into the thicket. Onward he plunged, crackling and rending, as the wild boar rushes through the underbrush. Little recked he of thorns and briars that scratched his flesh and tore his clothing, for all he thought of was to get by the shortest way to the greenwood glade where he knew the sound of the bugle horn came. Out he burst from the covert at last, a shower of little broken twigs falling about him, and, without pausing a moment, rushed forward and flung himself at Robin's feet. Then he clasped his arms round his master's knees, and all his body was shaken with great sobs. Neither could Robin nor Allan a Dale speak, but stood looking down at Little John, the tears rolling down their cheeks. While they thus stood, 7 royal rangers rushed into the open glade, and raised a great shout of joy at the sight of Robin, and at their head was Will Stutely. Then after a while came 4 more, panting with their running, and 2 of these 4 were Will Scathelock and Midge the miller, for all of these had heard the sound of Robin Hood's horn. All these ran to Robin and kissed his hands and his clothing with great sound of weeping. After a while Robin looked around him with tear-dimmed eyes, and said in a husky voice, "Now I swear that never again will I leave these dear woodlands. I have been away from them and from you too long. Now do I lay by the name of Robert, Earl of Huntingdon, and take upon me once again that nobler title, Robin Hood, the yeoman." At this a great shout went up, and all the yeomen shook one another's hands for joy. The news that Robin Hood had come back again to dwell in Sherwood as of old spread like wildfire all over the countryside, so that ere a se'nnight had passed, nearly all of his old yeomen had gathered about him again. But when the news of all this had reached the ears of King John, he swore both loud and deep, and took a solemn vow that he would not rest until he had Robin Hood in his power, dead or alive. Now there was present at court a certain knight, Sir William Dale, as gallant a soldier as ever donned harness. Sir William Dale was well acquainted with Sherwood Forest, for he was head keeper over that part of it that lay nigh to good Mansfield town. So to him the king turned, and bade him take an army of men and go straightway to seek Robin Hood. Likewise the king gave Sir William his signet ring to show to the sheriff that he might raise all his armed men to aid others in their chase of Robin. So Sir William and the sheriff set forth to do the king's bidding, and to search for Robin Hood, and for 7 days they hunted up and down, yet found him not. Now had Robin Hood been as peaceful as of old, everything might have ended in smoke, as other such ventures had always done before. But he had fought for years under King Richard, and was changed from what he used to be. It galled his pride to thus flee away before those sent against him, as a chased fox flees from the hounds. So thus it came about at last that Robin Hood and his yeomen met Sir William and the Sheriff and their men in the forest, and a bloody fight followed. The first man slain in that fight was the Sherriff of Nottingham, for he fell from his horse with an arrow in his brain ere 60 of shafts had been sped. Many a better man than the Sheriff kissed the sod that day, but at last Sir William Dale, being wounded and most of his men slain, he withdrew beaten and left the forest. But scores of good fellows were left behind him, stretched out all stiff beneath the sweet green boughs. But though Robin Hood had beaten off his enemies in a fair fight, all this lay heavily upon his mind, so that he brooded over it until a fever seized upon him. For 3 days it held him, and though he strove to fight it off, he was forced to yield at last. And thus it came that, on the morning of the 4th day, he called Little John to him, and told him that he could not shake the fever from him, and that he would go to his cousin, the prioress of the nunnery near Kirklees in Yorkshire, who was a skilful leech, and he would have her open a vein in his arm and take a little blood from him, for the bettering of his health. Then he bade Little John make ready to go also, for he might perchance need aid in his journeying. So Little John and he took their leave of the others, and Robin Hood bade Will Stutely to be the captain of the band until they should come back. Thus they came by easy stages and slow journeying until they reached the nunnery of Kirklees. Now Robin had done much to aid this cousin of his, for it was through King Richard's love of him that she had been made prioress of the place. But there is naught in the world so easily forgot as gratitude. So, when the prioress of Kirklees had heard how her cousin, the Earl of Huntingdon, had thrown away his earldom and gone back to Sherwood, she was vexed to the soul, and feared lest her cousinship with him should bring the king's wrath upon her also. Thus it happened that, when Robin came to her and told her how he wished her services as a leech, she began plotting ill against him in her mind, thinking that by doing evil to him she might find favour with his enemies. Nevertheless, she kept this well to herself, and received Robin with seeming kindness. She led him up a winding stone stair to a room which was just beneath the eaves of a high round tower, but she would not let Little John come with him. So the poor yeoman turned his feet away from the door of the nunnery, and left his master in the hands of the women. But though he did not come in, neither did he go far away, for he laid him down in a little glade near by, where he could watch the place that Robin abided, like some great faithful dog turned away from the door where his master has entered. After the women had gotten Robin Hood to the room beneath the eaves, the prioress sent all of the others away. Then, taking a little cord, she tied it tightly about Robin's arm, as though she were about to bleed him. And so she did bleed him. But the vein she opened was not one of those that lie close and blue beneath the skin. Deeper she cut than that, for she opened one of those veins through which the bright red blood runs leaping from the heart. Of this Robin knew not, for though he saw the blood flow, it did not come fast enough to make him think there was anything ill in it. Having done this vile deed, the prioress turned and left her cousin, locking the door behind her. All that lifelong day the blood ran from Robin Hood's arm, nor could he check it, though he strove in every way to do so. Again and again he called for help, but no help came, for his cousin had betrayed him, and Little John was too far away to hear his voice. So he bled and bled, until he felt his strength slipping away from him. Then he arose, tottering, and bearing himself up by the palms of his hands against the wall, he reached his bugle horn at last. Thrice he sounded it, but weakly and faintly, for his breath was fluttering through sickness and loss of strength. Nevertheless Little John heard it where he lay in the glade, and with a heart all sick with dread, he came running and leaping toward the nunnery. Loudly he knocked at the door, and in a loud voice shouted for them to let him in. But the door was of massive oak, strongly barred and studded with spikes, so they felt safe and bade Little John begone. Then Little John's heart was mad with grief and fear for his master's life. Wildly he looked about him, and his sight fell upon a heavy stone mortar such as 3 men could not lift nowadays. Little John took 3 steps forward, and, bending his back, heaved the stone mortar up from where it stood deeply rooted. Staggering under its weight, he came forward and hurled it crashing against the door. In burst the door, and away fled the frightened nuns, shrieking at his coming. Then Little John strode in, and never a word said he, but up the winding stone steps he ran, till he reached the room wherein his master was. Here he found the door locked also, but putting his shoulder against it, he burst the locks as though they were made of brittle ice. There he saw his own dear master, leaning against the grey stone wall, his face all white and drawn, and his head swaying to and fro with weakness. Then, with a great wild cry of love and grief and pity, Little John leapt forward and caught Robin Hood in his arms. Up he lifted him as a mother lifts her child, and carrying him to the bed, laid him tenderly thereon. And now the prioress came in hastily, for she was frightened at what she had done, and dreaded the vengeance of Little John and the others of the band. Then she staunched the blood by cunning bandages, so that it flowed no more. All the while Little John stood grimly by, and after she had done, he sternly bade her to be gone, and she obeyed, pale and trembling. Then after she had departed, Little John spake cheering words, laughing loudly, and saying that all this was a child's fright, and that no stout yeoman would die at the loss of a few drops of blood. "Why," quoth he, "give thee a se'nnight, and thou wilt be roaming the woodlands as boldly as ever." But Robin shook his head, and smiled faintly where he lay. "Mine own dear Little John," whispered he, "Heaven bless thy kind rough heart. But, dear friend, we will never roam the woodlands together again." "Aye, but we will," quoth Little John loudly. "I say again, aye, out upon it. Who dares say that any more harm shall come upon thee? Am I not by? Let me see who dares touch." Here he stopped off of a sudden, for his words choked him. At last he said in his deep, husky voice, "Now, if aught of harm befalls thee, because of this day's doings, I swear by St. George that the red cock shall crow over the roof-tree of this house, for the hot flames shall lick every crack and cranny thereof. As for these women," here he ground his teeth, "it will be an ill day for them." But Robin Hood took Little John's rough brown fist in his white hands, and chid him softly in his low weak voice, asking him since what time Little John had thought of doing harm to women, even in vengeance. Thus he talked, till at last the other promised in a choking voice that no ill should fall upon the place, no matter what happened. Then a silence fell, and Little John sat with Robin Hood's hand in his, gazing out of the open window, ever and anon swallowing a great lump that came in his throat. Meantime the sun dropped slowly in the west, till all the sky was ablaze with a red glory. Then Robin Hood, in a weak, faltering voice, bade Little John raise him, that he might look out once more upon the woodlands. So the yeoman lifted him in his arms, as he bade, and Robin Hood's head lay on his friend's shoulder. Long he gazed with a wide, lingering look, while the other sat with a bowed head, the hot tears rolling one after another from his eyes, and dripping upon his bosom, for he felt that the time of parting was near at hand. Then, presently, Robin Hood bade him string his stout bow for him, and chose a smooth fair arrow from his quiver. This Little John did, though without disturbing his master, or rising from where he sat. Robin Hood's fingers wrapped lovingly around his good bow, and he smiled faintly when he felt it in his grasp. Then he knocked the arrow on that part of the string that tips of his fingers knew so well. "Little John," said he, "Little John, mine own dear friend, and him I love better than all the others in the world. Mark, I prithee, where this arrow lodges, and there let my grave be digged. Lay me with my face toward the east, Little John, and see that my resting place be kept green, and that my weary bones be not disturbed." As he finished speaking, he raised himself of a sudden and sat upright. His old strength seemed to come back to him, and drawing the bowstring to his ear, he sped the arrow out of the open casement. As the shaft flew, his hand sank slowly with the bow till it lay across his knees, and his body likewise sank back again into Little John's loving arms. But something had sped from that body, even as the winged arrow sped from the bow. For some minutes Little John sat motionless, but presently he laid that which he held gently down. Then, folding the hands upon the breast and covering up the face, he turned upon his heel and left the room without a word or a sound. Upon the steep stairway he met the prioress and some of the chief among the sisters. To them he spoke in a deep, quivering voice, and said he, "An ye go within a score of feet of yonder room, I will tear down your rookery over your heads, so that not one stone shall be left upon another. Bear my words well in mind, for I mean them." So saying, he turned and left them, and they presently saw him running rapidly across the open and through the falling of the dusk, until he was swallowed up by the forest. The early grey of the coming morn was just beginning to lighten the black sky toward the eastward, when Little John and 6 more of the band came rapidly across the open toward the nunnery. They saw no one, for the sisters were all hidden away from sight, having been frightened by Little John's words. Up the stone stair they ran, and a great sound of weeping was presently heard. After a while this ceased, and then came the scuffling and shuffling of men's feet as they carried a heavy weight down the steep and winding stairs. So they went forth from the nunnery, and as they passed through the doors thereof, a great loud sound of wailing arose from the glade that lay all dark in the dawning, as though many men, hidden in the shadows, had lifted up their voices in sorrow. Thus died Robin Hood at Kirklees Nunnery in fair Yorkshire, with mercy in his heart toward those that had been his undoing. For thus he showed mercy for the erring and pity for the weak through all the time of his living. His yeomen were scattered henceforth, but no great ill befell them thereafter, for a more merciful sheriff, and one who knew them not so well, succeeded the one that had gone, and they being separated here and there throughout the countryside, they abided in peace and quietness, so that many lived to hand down these tales to their children and their children's children. A certain one saith that upon a stone at Kirklees is an old inscription. This I give in the ancient English in which it was written, and thus it runs: "Here underneath this little stone lies Robert, Earl of Huntingdon. Nae a archer were as he sae good, and people called him Robin Hood. Sic outlaws as he and his men, will England ne dare see again. Obit 24 Cal Decembris 1247." And now, dear friend, we also must part, for our merry journeyings have ended, and here at the grave of Robin Hood we turn, each going his own way. End of the epilogue. End of The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood by Howard Pyle. Read by Alex Foster, www.alexfoster.me.uk, on the 16th of March 2006, in Sherwood, Nottinghamshire.